Hi everyone, welcome to Wilkin and Guttenplan's quarterly webinar. The topic for today's webinar is 2015's New Jersey survey results. My name is Mohammed Saliani and I will be your moderator for today. We have two speakers today from our firm, Joseph Chorba, who is a manager here at Wilkin and Guttenplan, and Chris Frederick, who is also a manager here at Wilkin and Guttenplan. Joe has been with the firm for over 13 years. He divides his time between working with clients in the real estate industry and closely held businesses. As part of his real estate expertise, Joe works with a multitude of CIRAs throughout New York and New Jersey. His work with them includes audits, compilations, forecasts, and consulting. He also assists real estate clients with sponsor transition procedures and project management. Chris has been with us since 2012. He divides his time between working with clients in the real estate industry as well and closely held businesses. As part of his real estate expertise, Chris works with a multitude of CIRA clients throughout New Jersey. His work with them also includes audits, compilations, and consulting. He assists real estate clients with sponsor transition procedures and project management. Before we start the webinar itself, I'd like to give you a few housekeeping rules. To ask any questions, please use the question pane in the GoToWebinar dashboard on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Throughout the webinar, we will have a few polling questions. This will help us get a sense of the webinar participants and their experience. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website at www.wgcpas.com. Now, a little talk about the survey itself. Wilkin and Guttenplan has been doing this survey and is the only one in New Jersey that does such a survey. This is our 7th edition of the survey for the last 21 years. The survey allows boards to compare financial data of similar-sized associations and be able to make certain decisions. The purpose of the webinar is to review and analyze historical data from 2002 all the way through 2014. To identify and discuss trends, and to provide the board with a tool to assist them with their financial decision-making process. We are going to be discussing 6 topics today. The first one is maintenance assessments, then we'll move on to assessments receivable and allowance for doubtful accounts, which is a special topic that I'm sure all of you would like to hear about. We'll then go on to special assessments. We'll talk about municipal reimbursements. We'll do an expense breakdown for multi-story and co-ops, and we will end with the replacement fund. The format of the webinar. Information will be shown in the form of graphs and charts. Different CIRA types and sizes have been selected for each topic. Analysis and suggestions will be discussed after each category. Please note that this is a non-statistical survey. There are limitations to the information reflected due to the size of the population. Now, before we start the webinar itself, we have a polling question for you. To get a sense of our audience, please indicate if you are 1, a board member or a homeowner, 2, a property manager, a professional, or other. All right, so it looks like majority of the listeners are board members with about 54% and about 33% as property managers. The remaining are professionals and others. I will now move on to Joe and let him take it away.
Thank you, Mohammed. So we're excited to bring you this little webinar to look at some of the trends that we've had over the last decade or so. In the beginning, we were doing the survey, but it was kind of in a vacuum where we were really only analyzing the data for that period of time. But recently, we decided to take a look back and see where things are headed and where things have been over the last few years, and maybe try to get an indication of where things are headed and take a look at the data and see where we are. So we're going to start with something that's easy, that everybody knows, and this chart really shouldn't be a shock to anyone, because we know that over the last 12 years that maintenance assessments have certainly increased. So you can see here that they've increased at a rate, in some categories are close to CPI. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner over the same period, the Consumer Pricing Index, which tracks inflation and the increase in costs, was at about 29% over the same period. And you can see the categories that we chose for the next few slides are mostly condos. Condos 1 to 50 units, 51 to 125, condos 126 to 200, and condos 201 to 500. So we can see that most of these categories, the costs are actually ahead of inflation by a bit. So that tells us a few things. We'll get into a little bit in a few more slides. So what does that tell us? It tells us, obviously, on average, the maintenance fees have increased steadily over the last decade. That the increase in maintenance fees over the past few years have been greater than the Consumer Pricing Index. So what does that mean for us? Well, if you've heard us talk at meetings, we usually say when it comes to increases in maintenance fees, we usually recommend that a small increase each year in maintenance fees is usually more acceptable to the community, and it's usually easier for your unit owners to budget and manage over a long period of time. You know, one of the things that we find that board members sometimes get into a little bit of trouble is when they decide not to raise their maintenance fees. You know, and sometimes if you do it for a year or two, that's fine, because that may all depend on how things are going, where your expenses are, and you may not necessarily need an increase in those years. But we usually recommend a small increase each year, even in those years where your expenses are you know, fairly consistent. And we recommend that so you can avoid large increases after a number of years without an increase. So let's take a look at something else that obviously is connected to your maintenance fees, is your assessments receivable. And this chart is interesting. It confirms a lot of what we thought, but if you look right around 2008, from 2008 to 2014, we've seen a spike in the average year-end receivable balances. So we've seen an increase pretty much across the board with all the same categories. And that's not surprising, because right around 2008, if you remember, we had a downturn in the economy and also the housing market, which affected people's ability to pay their maintenance fees. So this chart really isn't that surprising that there was a spike, and that spike kind of started around the 2008 time. So along those lines, I wanted to take a look and see, okay, we've had an increase in maintenance fees, but how does that compare, an increase in your accounts receivable, but how does that compare to the total maintenance fees for the year? So, you know, normally if you look at the category of 201 to 500, that's probably what we would have hoped to see. So as your AR, as your maintenance fees increase, of course your AR is going to increase, but the hope would be that it would be a fairly consistent percentage of your total maintenance fees. But what we're seeing in the other three categories, and with some of the categories that aren't represented here, is that the percentage of maintenance fees has actually increased. So what that tells us is that over the last 3 years, from 2011 to 2014, the accounts receivable balances for the unit owners has actually increased, and perhaps the number of unit owners that are not paying their maintenance fees or who are delinquent has also increased during that period of time. So another category that's directly connected to your accounts receivable and your maintenance fees is your allowance for doubtful accounts. Now remember, allowance for doubtful accounts is your estimate of the uncollectible balances at the end of each year. And again, if you were to go back and take a look at the chart on maintenance fees, it's almost a mirror image of this chart here on allowance for doubtful accounts. So obviously, as your maintenance fees go up and your accounts receivable also goes up, so does your estimate of allowance for doubtful accounts or uncollectible balances. So one of the last slides I want to take a look at is we then compared our allowance for doubtful accounts to our accounts receivable balance at the end of the year. And we wanted to look at the percentage increase over each of the 3-year periods that we conducted the survey going back to 2002. And you can see here that the charts are very similar. So we can see that as the increase in your accounts receivable balance increases, also does your average allowance for doubtful accounts. But what this chart shows us is if you look at the period from 2009 to 2011, what's interesting about this is also going back to previous charts where we saw a spike starting around 2008. And what that tells us is that there was really a change in methodology or a change in how boards and their professionals approach their accounts receivables. And during that time, obviously, we had more people not paying their maintenance fees, and accounts receivable was growing. But what also happened around that time was a downturn in the housing market, which meant a lot of people had less equity in their units, or they had no equity in their units, which affected their ability to pay their maintenance fees. And it also affected the association's ability to collect those balances. So in the past, even if their maintenance fees may have been, or their accounts receivable may have been high, it was always the thought process, well, you know, the housing market is great. Most of the time people have equity in their unit. We'll be able to collect those balances when they sell their unit. But right around 2008 is when that changed. So that's why, even though the charts are similar, you see a higher percentage increase in the allowance for doubtful accounts than you do in the actual year-end receivable balances, because there was a shift in how boards and professionals approach those balances and their estimate or their ability to collect it. So what does all of this tell us? As we know, assessments receivable and allowance are clearly linked to each other. Associations should be realistic or include a realistic budget line item for bad debts. Board should have a strict collection policy that includes board oversight, timing of initial letter, timing of the attorney involvement, and timing of liens and foreclosures. And there's just something I guess I'd like to add to that is, over the past few years, the attorneys, there's a lot of other tools that are at board's disposal, and you should talk to your attorneys on how and when, or if they're appropriate for you, things like rent receivership. Sometimes you're able to take a unit over in a sheriff's sale and start collecting rent. So there's a lot more available to the boards now to be able to try and recover some of those past balances. It's all very important that you stay on top of them. Sometimes when boards, they feel like they're the bad guy because they're going out and trying to collect, or they almost become a collection agency. But I have to tell you that when you stay on top of people, you're the good guys, because you're protecting them from themselves. If you can get them to pay sooner, the further they get behind, the harder it is for them to make up. And also, you're protecting the people that are paying. So stay on top of your unit owners and be consistent with your collection policy.
Joe, so I have a question that's come up here. What is the consequence of an association not budgeting for bad debt expense?
Well, that's a good question. That's a question that I actually get a lot at board meetings when it comes to this issue. And we've been recommending for several years now that when there's consistent unit owners not paying their maintenance fees, that a budget line item should be included for bad debt. And what's happening is if you're not including a bad debt line item for the uncollectible balances, at the end of the year, there is a chance that you could have some cash flow shortages. So the unfortunate reality is that the unit owners who are paying their maintenance fees have to make up the difference for the unit owners who are not paying their maintenance fees. The bills still have to get paid, your landscaper has to get paid, your professionals have to get paid, management has to get paid, whether you have a few unit owners paying their maintenance fees or not. And by including a bad debt line item, you're planning and estimating, you're planning for that type of cash flow shortage. So it's important to be realistic in your budget in all line items, including a line item for bad debt, so that you can plan for those unit owners who are not paying their maintenance fees and make sure that you have enough cash available to pay your operating expenses.
Very true, Joe. And I just received a comment from one of the listeners as well, who was mentioning that, some of these associations are facing a tough time because the banks are not foreclosing, and they're stuck in limbo because they can't collect the maintenance fees, of course, and the bank doesn't want to pay for it. So it just adds to the tab. Very true.
Which makes it even more important. I'm sorry, Mohammed. Just one last point. Just makes it even more important to stay on top of your unit owners, have a quality policy, and work closely with your attorneys to make sure that your unit owners don't get too far behind, and that you're able to keep your cash flow moving.
Absolutely. All right, so before we move on to the next topic, we're going to have another polling question that you can see here. For those of you who have had a special assessment in the past 3 years, what was the purpose of the assessment? For those of you who had multiple assessments, please select the largest assessment that you did have. Was it snow, capital projects, Hurricane Sandy, or something else? All right, it looks like snow here was the clear winner with about 65%, and 25 or 26% with capital projects, and the rest was other. So it's obvious that weather has played an important role in our financing of the associations. Go ahead, Chris.
All right, thanks, Mohammed. We'll keep on the subject of special assessments, which you can see from the first graph here is the amount of associations included in our survey that have had special assessments, over the past 12 years. I think what you see is after the 2008 year, there's quite a big spike up to 2011, and a good majority of that 112 from 2011 had to do with the old Hurricane Sandy. It seems like all the associations that incurred some severe damage because of that, it took them a couple years to get around and to get that all buttoned up. So by 2011, that's what I think we've seen a lot of special assessments for. And I think the polling question indicates exactly where the special assessments are coming from now. The past couple years have been wild for snow, and a lot of associations have had to put together a special assessment, to pick up the difference between, the budgeted snow figure and the actual costs incurred. To kind of reiterate, the number of participants in the survey that had a special assessment since 2008 have risen. Some of the factors include major weather events, hurricanes and snows. Those are very difficult to predict and project coming when you're putting together, 1 year's budget. Especially for the hurricane, some associations incurred millions of dollars in damage, which insurance didn't cover. Kind of left the associations holding the bag. And even now with snow, it's impossible to predict exactly how much snow you're going to be getting year over year. And it'd be nice if the snow would be consistent year over year. You wouldn't have to worry about it, but that's just not always how it shakes out. As Joe was talking about, there's been a big increase in AR and bad debt, resulting in cash flow shortages. Like Joe mentioned, the bills all need to be paid, and when it comes to the end of the day, and there's some members who don't pay, we can allow for them, but ultimately the associations, that we've seen some examples of have had to raise cash just to fund the operating needs. And finally, another factor is the shortfalls in funds set aside for the replacement fund. We'll get to the replacement fund later, but the long and short of it is, some of our associations are beginning to age, and there are instances when not all associations are putting aside enough money to fund these large capital projects, or the replacement fund wasn't updated often enough, and the costs, to update the facade of a building, a roof, comes in a lot higher than you've been reserving for it, and as a result, you've had to raise money some way, and the quickest way for an association to do that is through a special assessment. A point that we try to bring across is special assessments should be implemented timely. If come March you've tripled your snow budget, that's probably a good time for boards to consider a special assessment, with the reason being, when March there's still snow on the ground, your residents are still slipping on it, tripping on it, having to deal with it. It's a lot easier and a lot more palatable to say, hey, here's where the snow came in, 3 times budget, we're going to need to raise a special assessment, as opposed to August or September when, it's sunny, everyone's hanging out by the pool, they get a notice in the mail that says, oh, special assessment for snow, you look around, it's 100 degrees, maybe a cold day wouldn't be so bad, so, implementing the same special assessment in March, could have made it more palatable because, hey, you see those 3 feet of snow around the clubhouse, you see all that snow on the sidewalks, you've been slipping getting to the mailbox, it's just more present in the mind. Recently there's been an article on our website, that talks exactly about snow, and it's about snow blowing the budget. I encourage you to hop on our website, check out that article. It's a great article written by Jules a year or two ago. So moving forward, we'll touch base on municipal reimbursements. So if you take a look here, lately, it's relatively leveled out with the number of participants in the survey which have been receiving a municipal reimbursement. 194 in 2008, 180 in 2011, 219 in the most recent survey. That's over 53% of survey respondents who have received a special assessment this year for our survey. So, a significant percentage of associations that might be eligible to receive a reimbursement by a local municipality, may not actually be getting it. A couple years ago in the state, the Kelly bill passed, which allows reimbursements to be reimbursed for costs that they're incurring for maintaining public roadways. Like, for example, if it's not a gated community and anybody can drive through the road, but the association is paying to clear it, there's a potential for the local municipality to reimburse the association for it. We see it often with street lighting, occasionally garbage removal, snow plowing, certainly. For associations not currently receiving a reimbursement, but you feel like you're owed one. It's probably a good time for the board to really understand why you're not receiving it, or if you're not receiving it, maybe it's time to find out why, and if you're owed it, let's start collecting it. I mean, that's, if the association has been operating and not receiving the special assessment, this could be, some found money. I mean, and our municipal reimbursements, we're not talking about tens of thousands of dollars usually, but hey, if it can help defer $8,000-10,000 of snow clearing costs, why not? And even if the association is receiving a municipal reimbursement, it's important that the association understand the municipality's calculation, to be sure that they're receiving the maximum amount, and after you get a few years in, you might even be able to incorporate the anticipated future reimbursement, from the municipality in your upcoming budgets.
So, Chris, I have a question that just came up. One of the board members here was asking, how do I know if my association is receiving the correct reimbursement?
That's a great question, and I think without a little bit of due diligence, definitely you can talk to your accountant. You can have them review the calculation. The calculation from the township is public record. So if you go to your local municipality, if you're receiving a reimbursement, they should be able to provide you, and they have to provide you with the basis for their calculation. For example, if it's snow clearing and you're clearing for them, however, a mile worth of road, there's a standard, and every township's different, but there's a standard clearing allocation per mile of road, for example. So there's an opportunity, to recalculate how much the association is being reimbursed. And if they're not being reimbursed enough, it's important we find that out as soon as we can to go back to these municipalities, to make sure that the association is getting their fair shake.
Yeah, Chris, you're absolutely right. A few years ago, I was actually in this situation. I had one of my clients that felt that they might not be getting what they should be getting, and they engaged us to do an audit of what the municipality was paying them. So I went up to the municipal's office and I spoke to the lady there. She gave me all the information. We sat down and we calculated it. And the interesting thing was that it looked like that the payroll that you calculated had some factors that are not included in there. And we ended up getting the association on average. It was a small association, so we ended up getting them on average about $1,000 to $1,500 extra every year. I mean, it may not seem a lot, but over the years it does add up.
Absolutely. Mohammed, to your point, once you find that that error in the calculation, that's in perpetuity.
Exactly.
You'll always be getting that extra small increase in cash. It sounds like it's not a terrible investment for some of these boards and associations to consider.
Absolutely.
Getting your accountant, your management company to gather some data just to make sure we're getting every penny that we're owed.
Yep. I mean, there's no harm in asking the question.
Absolutely. We're providing the service for the township. We're clearing the snow. We're lighting the roads. And if every other area in the township gets that service on the township's dime, why shouldn't you as an association?
Absolutely.
All right. We'll turn it back over to Joe.
Okay. Good job, Chris. Just to wrap that up too, don't just assume that you're getting what you're entitled to. I guess that's the moral of that story. So, moving on to a couple categories that we haven't really talked about too much are multi-story buildings and co-ops. So, multi-story buildings and co-ops face a lot of the same issues that other condos do, but they have some of their own issues that are kind of unique to their style of building. And when we take a look at this chart, it kind of shows us the breakdown of how the different categories of expenses play out. For a multi-story building, you're going to see a difference between a multi-story and the co-ops. Co-ops have a few things that are unique to them as well. But we wanted to take a look at how things broke down and see if there was anything that we can kind of figure out from that. And as you can see here, a large portion of their expenses here are your building and grounds, and some other categories that the boards have a little less control over, your utilities and your payroll. But with the building and grounds, it's very important in these multi-story buildings to take a look at ways to reduce your expenses. And when I talk to boards about reducing your expenses, I think boards have to be very careful on how they do that. And they have to be careful so that they don't affect the quality of life or the amenities or the services that are provided to their unit owners, because those types of things have a direct effect on their property values. And ultimately, the boards have a fiduciary responsibility for protecting assets, protecting their home values, and it's a big job and it's a big responsibility. Protecting your assets are going to include protecting your cash and other receivables, those types of assets, making sure that you're collecting all your receivables, like we talked about before, having good controls over your cash and other types of cash transactions, your expenses. But you also have a fiduciary responsibility for protecting your physical assets. And that's kind of where these expenses come into play. Your building, grounds, and other, there are ways out there where you can reduce your expenses, protecting your cash and your maintenance fees, and at the same time properly maintaining the building and all that goes into that. So let's take a look at the multi-story breakdown. So like I said, in some of the categories, to a lesser extent on the multi-story buildings, and you'll see in a few minutes on the co-ops, but the board has limited control over a portion of the operating expenses. But even in some of those categories, when I say limited control, they do have some control over how much they're paying for certain items. Payroll, it depends on whether or not it's a union building or not, how much control they really have over the payroll and the maintenance staff and the super and the porter and all of those types of personnel. But they do have some control over maybe some of the benefits that they have to pay, depending on whether or not they're union employees. And the utilities. So items for consideration. When I talk about utilities, utility contract negotiation. In recent years with the deregulation in New Jersey, the pricing on utilities has become very competitive. So it's important for boards to go out there and try to find the best rates that they're paying for their utilities. And that could include, maybe finding another company to purchase the commodities from the gas and the electric from, to negotiating fixed rates, fixed fees on those contracts. So there are ways that you can monitor your utilities. The other big piece to this for the multi-stories and the co-ops is the use of technology and value engineering. So what does that mean? When we talk about value engineering, and again, you should consult with your professionals, your management company, and also your engineering when it comes to these types of things. But when you're talking about value engineering, what does that mean? When it comes time for upgrades or analyzing maybe your mechanical systems or your lighting or some of the other areas of the building, you may want to look at different options. For example, high efficiency lighting, maybe high efficiency bulbs or high efficiency fixtures. They may cost a little bit more, and the sticker shock on the price to replace them might be a little much. But when you really dig into it, there's a lot of potential for some savings there. And you really need to work with your engineer and your accountants to determine the payback period on some of those capital improvements and the effect that those capital improvements have on your operating expenses. You can use the lighting, for example. Depending on the efficiency of those lightings, it can have a major effect on the amount of utilities that you pay.
Actually, Joe, just to add on to that, I don't know if some of the board members are aware, but sometimes there are rebates that are available to associations when they decide to go ahead and change the lighting to get high efficiency bulbs installed throughout the building. I think the state has some rebates that are there. If they would be available on the website. If anybody is interested, you can absolutely contact your accountant or us, and we can find out if there's any rebate that's available for you.
Yep, and those change frequently. So check back, and you may be make sure on those types of rebates or programs that might be available. Make sure if they're due to expire or when they're going to expire, or maybe even the potential for some new programs that people are talking about that might be coming out in future years. Keep that in mind when you're planning your projects.
Absolutely. Okay.
So now let's take a look at our operating expense breakdown for the co-ops. Now, some of these co-ops, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them have a similar makeup in physical structure as some of the multi-story buildings, and they have a lot of the same issues as a multi-story building. But we know in the co-op the ownership is different. So the co-op is the one who's paying the real estate taxes, and they're the ones that hold the mortgage, so they're paying the interest on the mortgage. So the co-ops, you see an even larger piece of the pie that's really the board has limited control, and we'll talk about the limited control in a second on some of these items. But if you look at real estate taxes and interest, if you add those two pieces together, that's over 40% of your budget. That's a huge number. Typically your monthly carrying charges for co-ops are typically higher than a regular condo for that reason, because they have other large expenses that they're responsible for paying. So the other items are fairly consistent with the multi-story buildings and their piece of the pie, so to speak. But the big pieces here that makes co-ops unique are obviously your real estate taxes and your interest that you pay. So again, like the multi-story, boards have limited control over a larger portion of the operating expenses. Like I said, real estate taxes and interest expense make up almost over 40% of the budget. And again, items for consideration. So real estate tax appeal. Again, work with your attorneys because there may be a potential for annual or municipalities again are different on when you can appeal, but work with your attorneys to see if an appeal makes sense for you to try and keep your real estate taxes. That's why I said when you have limited control, there is some control over some of these items. And your mortgage interest. Rates are still very low. They're still very competitive. So again, just keep an eye on that to make sure that you're getting the best rate possible. And if refinance makes sense, that's something that you should consider. And obviously, you need to be looking at the loan terms and if there's a prepayment penalty, and that all needs to be considered when you're considering a refinance. Utility contract negotiations we talked about, and again, use of technology and value engineering.
So, Joe, a question had come up about the technology and value engineering. Somebody was asking, do you have any suggestions on any other type of technological changes that an association might do so that they could, in the long run, reap the benefits?
Well, there's some mechanical options, high efficiency boilers, solar panels. Those are higher cost items. So if your boiler's coming to towards the end of their useful life, that's something that really should be considered. Solar panels, again, that's going to depend on the makeup of the building and whether or not that's a feasible option. But there's other options where the use of electronics on your boilers to monitor and regulate the temperatures in your building, that has a huge effect on your utility costs. There may be other ways to use technology to reduce the repair expenses on new equipment and also your existing equipment to reduce the maintenance on those items. There are ways out there. There are some low-cost ways and there's some high-cost ways, but the important thing is to just like anything else, you need to weigh the cost-benefit on all of these and make sure that the benefit actually outweighs the cost and that it makes sense for you.
Yep, you're absolutely right. I mean, you definitely need to speak to your engineer because, as Joe said, some of these items like the boilers, they may cost more in the beginning, but if you look at it in the long run, the benefit of putting in a high efficiency boiler might be better for the association. So now we're moving on to the polling question number 3. Over the past several years, has your annual replacement fund contribution, number 1, increased, decreased, stayed the same, or you don't know? All right, so it's a little surprising here, actually. The interesting thing here is that more people say that their replacement funding has stayed the same than those that say that it has increased. 48% said that it has stayed the same. 41% have said that it increased, and 7% of the people said they're not sure. So for those of you who are not sure, the suggestion that I have is probably obtain a copy of the study if possible and look at it and try and make sure that you look back in the past years to see how much you've been funding and what the study says that you should be funding. Anyway, we'll turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk a bit more about the replacement funding.
Thanks, Mohammed. So those are interesting results of our poll. And I think if you take a look here, you see the trend, just like the maintenance assessments, that the annual contribution in dollars to these replacements funds have increased I think the one anomaly that I just want to point out, and I think it'll be important, we'll talk about it a few times as we go forward, are those smaller homeowner associations with less than 100 units. You know, if you take a look from 2011 to 2014, there was actually a slight decrease in the annual funding by dollar. Obviously, overall, since 2002, they're up 64%, but within the last, 3-4 years, they've decreased. So that could be part of the reason for the people who said, hey, they've remained flat. Looking at the mid-sized condos, 51 to 125, the increase from 2011 to 2014 is relatively minor. There were some big increases from 2005 to 2011. But the way that they sit now, they've flattened out for a couple. And then you look at some of the bigger homeowner associations, and some of the bigger condos. Since 2002, they've about doubled the number of dollars that they're contributing into their replacement fund. So it's a bit across the board. And this is an important slide to kind of keep in the back of your mind. We'll touch on the stuff represented here, a few times as we go forward. So this here is the percentage of the maintenance fees allocated to the replacement fund, as a percentage increase. We know maintenance assessments have increased. Joe talked about that, when we got started here. And I think the important thing to note is, hey, the amount of the maintenance fees that's being assigned to the capital replacement fund is increasing in a greater percentage than your maintenance fees are increasing. What that's telling me. That's telling me that, we're getting some new studies and we're having to put more money aside for those future repair and replacements. And the place that those monies are coming from is from reducing the amount of cash that we're allocating to some of our other expenses. If you take a look back in 2002 when we really started this, it was, say between 8 and 12% of total maintenance assessments were being set aside for for the replacement fund. If you look where we're at now, we've got homeowner associations. They're at both about the 17%, and condos, they're both about the 22%. What's interesting is that both homeowner associations are at the same spot, and both condos are at the same spot. I think, I think that just what that's showing you is homeowner associations, regardless of size, you're dealing with the same replacement items. You've all got items that some of these some of the condos don't necessarily have to the same degree. So this next slide here is a pretty interesting slide. It's the replacement fund, how well it's being funded as far as in dollars. So every year, everybody's setting aside and making an allocation to the replacement fund, but just because the allocation has been made doesn't mean the cash was transferred to fund that allocation. And to me, what's interesting here is the transition from 2008 to 2011. There was a pretty big underfunding of cash flow, and I think that talks back to, if you remember Joe's slide about accounts receivable from 2008 to 2011, we had a major portion of the population who wasn't paying their maintenance assessments. And again, it all kind of comes full circle to talk to Joe's point. We had to pay the management company, we had to pay the landscaper. So where does that money come from? Well, we didn't put all the money aside into the replacement fund, like we said we were going to. And if you look forward into 2014, we've seen maintenance assessments increase, and ARs increased, bad debts increased, but maintenance assessments have probably increased in a greater percentage than anything. So we've been able to catch up our funding. If you look across the board, the three condo sizes we've noted here, and the the larger HOAs, they're all still slightly underfunded, but not necessarily to the degree that they were underfunded in 2011. And typically these are cyclical. In 2011, the issue was identified, and now through 2014 we've been able to catch up.
So Chris, I have a question that's come up. Are there any consequences of having high interfund balances?
Yeah, so there absolutely are some consequences. A big one has to do with cash flow. You've been allocating money to the replacement fund, but you haven't been sending it there. All of a sudden, what do you know? The roads need to be repaved, or the roof needs to be replaced. The facade of your high-rise needs to be done. There might be, had you funded properly and set aside the proper amount of cash, the association might not have to deal with. Again, it comes back to a special assessment. Had you put aside the proper amount of cash, you might not have had to done that special assessment for that capital project.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. It comes back to what Joe said earlier, is that it relates to a certain extent to your receivables, to making sure that you're budgeting correctly and at a realistic level. If you're not budgeting for bad debt expense, therefore you're not collecting what you anticipated, you're going to have to, and I say this in quotes, borrow from somewhere else. So most associations, where do they borrow from? They borrow from their reserves or their replacement fund, because that's the easiest one to get to. And eventually there is a consequence, and somebody has to pay for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, the cash might be there to pay the bills today, but what happens, to your point, Mohammed, what happens in a few years when you need a big capital project and there's no money?
Absolutely.
It's got to come from somewhere, and ultimately, like Joe, again, what Joe said, all those good homeowners who pay their balances, we're going to put a special, there has to be a special assessment to fund that capital project, and everyone's going to have to kick in a little extra.
Yeah, we can't, like our politicians, just kick the can down the road.
Right, exactly. And someone's got to pay for it. Same thing, same thing with with these replacement fund. If we kick the can down the road to borrow the money for our operating expense, eventually someone's going to have to pay for it.
Yes.
All right, so we'll take a look at the types of funding. I think this chart here is very interesting. We'll take a quick second to go through the different types of funding. So full funding is where an association, this is the most conservative method. The association puts aside full dollars for every individual item on their engineering study. We say, okay, the engineer put together a study. We definitely don't want to have to do a special assessment, so we'll do a full funding. Threshold funding is where the association sets a threshold, 5, 10, 15%, and says, we never want our balance in our replacement fund to be less than our threshold. So let's fund whatever we need to every year to make sure that we are properly funded to our set threshold. And then baseline is saying, we just don't want to go below zero. It's saying, let's fund whatever it takes to not be negative. So if you look in the 2002 year, a lot of the condos that we've specifically pulled aside here, and I think this is the same across the board, they were doing full funding. They were saying, let's be conservative, and if you remember, this is when the AR was low. We say, hey, the opinion was, let's be conservative, let's contribute enough money to set aside so that as items go bad and they need major replacements, we have the cash and there's not even a concern about it. You jump forward 12 years and you say, oh, look where we're at. Threshold funding, is saying it's a little less conservative. Associations are saying, okay, let's not necessarily pass the increased maintenance assessments to continue to full fund. Let's fund a little bit less, but let's fund with the hope that the threshold will be met and we never, need to worry about special assessments. But it's definitely a less conservative funding method than the full funding.
So, Chris, one of the questions that's come up here, are there any risks associated with using threshold or baseline funding?
Sure, there sure are risks. We're not, the associations, you guys aren't paying your engineer to update your study every year. Prices are constantly increasing. I'm sure if you look at your replacement study from 3 years ago, the replacement costs are probably a bunch cheaper than they are today. So if you fund using a baseline or a threshold funding, you're funding on old dollars. So say your study's from 2010 at this point, you're funding on baseline, for example, you're funding on $2010. Next thing you know, the road needs to be replaced today. Well, I tell you what, that paving company is not going to take your 2010 valuation. They're going to want current dollars. So the replacement cost of that road project, for example, is going to be a lot higher than what you've been reserving for on your old study. So there's, as a result, your replacement fund is going to be overall underfunded when you take more money out than you set aside for that road project.
Right, Chris. And also, the study is just an estimate of, there's two variables to it. The one is the cost and the other one is the estimated remaining useful life. And if you're using baseline funding and it has a certain estimated useful life, for example, as you mentioned, the roads, but suddenly because of all the snow that we've had, now the roads have started to crack and you need to redo them, say 3 or 4 years earlier than what the study anticipated. And now you're behind the 8 ball because now you don't have enough money because you've not collected what was expected, and you needed to replace it a few years earlier than what was anticipated.
That's absolutely. That's why the replacement study calls them estimated useful life.
Exactly.
If they could predict the future, they'd probably charge a heck of a lot more. All right, so we'll move on to the percentage of the total replacement costs that are currently funded. So I think what's important here, we think back to the last slide. We see a lot more associations using a threshold funding, not using the full funding. Take a look at the 2002 number. Associations, and this is across the board. This is both condos and homeowner associations. The funding was a lot more healthy, so to speak, back then. There was between 27 and 30% funding, where let's fast forward to today. We see a lot of associations reducing the amount that they're setting aside for their replacement funding. The studies from the engineering are coming back and having a lot higher replacement costs as a result of that percentage funding. And if you look, it's decreased across the board. Sure, you look at some of the larger homeowner associations, the decrease might have been from 30% down to closer to 25, but take a look at some of the smaller homeowner associations, went from 27 down to 7%. And that speaks to exactly the question, that was sent in. Now that people are doing, associations are using this threshold funding, all of a sudden, the money set aside in this replacement fund isn't quite as high and as healthy as it was, 12 years ago. And obviously the concern there goes back to, to Mohammed's point, what happens, when something needs to be done early. This again kind of all circles back to, well, the only way to pay for it is take a loan or a special assessment. And if you take a loan, that's just another expense the association is going to have to incur. At the end of the day, the members of the association are going to be paying for it. So just some general observations on the replacement fund. And this is kind of just a little recap. Although associations have been steadily increasing the annual budgeted for contributions, not all the cash is necessarily being transferred. And despite the fact that budgeted contributions have increased, the most common method of funding has shifted from full to threshold funding. Again, that shift to threshold funding has resulted in the percentage of total replacement costs that are currently funded to decline. Associations should really try to eliminate, to Mohammed's point, that interfund balance. You always want to make sure you have enough cash to pay for the large capital projects that are set aside. It's one thing to make the allocation, but it's an entirely different concept to send the cash. By shifting to threshold funding, it's vital for associations to really update the study on a regular basis. And this goes back to the threshold funding being a less conservative funding method. There's really less cushion for components that may need to be replaced sooner than anticipated. That less cushion for unexpected costs, for unexpected rises in those replacement costs. So I think the big takeaway from taking a look at where the associations have shifted their replacement funding is that they're becoming less conservative, and although they might be allocating more dollars to it, the replacement costs of these common major amenities have also increased at a greater rate than our increase in dollar contribution. So it's important that the associations stay on top of what they're currently funding, what the legitimate future estimated cash needs are for those replacement costs, and to try to make sure that the cash is there and available to pay for that.
You're absolutely right, Chris. The thing here is that associations have been facing the cash crunch because of the situation with the receivables. They're trying not to keep increasing the maintenance fees and have those people who are paying have to carry the ones who are not. And so associations are looking for other means to try and cover that cash and keep the association running. And one of that is moving to a more riskier type of funding, which is the threshold funding, which is it's definitely an accepted way of funding, but what the associations and what the boards have to make sure is that once they have a threshold study done and they decide to go with the threshold funding, they need to fund in accordance with that study. They need to make sure that the study is updated on a regular basis and make sure that you have the engineer come and meet with you and discuss the study. Sometimes even if you decide to go to a threshold funding, the jump from the old study to the new study could be quite significant. And if you meet with the engineer, you can come up with a kind of possibly a step-up basis where you move slowly every year to where you need to be. And you have enough money as and when you need it to replace those items. So with that, we have come to the end of our webinar for today. We hope that it has been useful to the people who have been listening in. I know that budget season is in full swing at the moment for some of you still. Some of you may have completed your budgets, but we hope that this is a tool for you and it kind of helps you to guide towards where you think you might need to be. I thank Joe and Chris for putting together this webinar and going over the survey that we've done. As you know, we do this every 3 years, and hopefully in 3 years we'll see these guys again and we'll talk about these things again. And if you have any questions about the webinar, or if you would like to listen to it again, it will be on our website in a couple of days. And feel free to reach out to any of us. As you can see on the screen now are our email addresses, so feel free to reach out and ask us any questions even after the webinar is complete. All right, thank you very much, and we hope to see you again in the next quarter. We will be letting you know. Keep tuned. We'll be letting you know what our next webinar is going to be about, and please sign in to listen to that one. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.